The entrance is a crack in the rock, a narrow fissure in the sandstone cliffs of southern Jordan, in places barely wide enough for two people to pass each other, its walls rising on either side to heights of 80 or 100 meters, the sky above reduced to a thin ribbon of blue. This passageway is called the Sick, and for most of human history it was the only practical entrance to the city that lay at its far end. Walking through it, in the half-light between the towering walls of red and ochre and cream-colored stone, you feel the weight of the rock above you and the silence that settles between the cliffs like something solid. The sound of your footsteps bounces off the stone. The temperature drops several degrees from the open desert outside. The Sick is more than a kilometer long. At certain points it narrows to less than 2 meters. The walls are smooth in some places and sculptured by erosion in others, their colors shifting from deep red to pale gold to lavender in the changing angle of the light. Cut into the lower sections of the rock face, at about knee height, are 2 channels carved by human hands. Small, precise grooves running along the base of the walls, one on each side of the passage, following the line of the rock with a care that suggests their makers understood exactly how water moved through confined spaces. These channels carried water into the city, and they are among the first signs that the civilization whose capital you are approaching was not simply a community that happened to live in this spectacular landscape, but one that had mastered it. At the far end of the Sick, the passage opens suddenly, and there it is, the treasury, carved directly into the face of a sandstone cliff, its facade rising 39 meters above the plaza floor, its columns and pediments and carved figures emerging from the living rock with a precision and an elegance that stops most visitors in their tracks. The treasury is not actually a treasury. It is almost certainly a royal tomb. But it has become the defining image of Petra, the image that appears on every poster and every travel guide, the image that concentrates in a single facade the ambition and the skill of the civilization that created it. That civilization was the Nabatean kingdom, and tonight we spend time within the city it built, a city of tens of thousands of people in one of the most arid landscapes of the ancient world, sustained not by a river or a lake but by the mastery of water itself. The light inside the Sick changes constantly as you walk. The walls channel it, redirect it, concentrate it into shafts and pools that move across the stone as the sun moves. In this changing light, the colors of the sandstone seem to breathe. Deep red becoming orange, becoming cream, becoming something that has no name. The people who walked this passage 2,000 years ago saw the same light and the same colors. They walked the same floor and heard the same silence between the high walls. The Sick is one of those rare places where the distance between the ancient past and the present collapses into something almost immediate. Petra was not supposed to exist. The southern Jordanian plateau, known as the Wadi Rum and its surrounding highlands, receives an average annual rainfall of between 70 and 200 millimeters, depending on elevation. That is not enough to support a large settled population under conventional conditions. The ancient civilizations that we remember most clearly, Egypt, Mesopotamia, the Indus Valley, built their cities in river valleys or on lake margins, in places where water was present and reliable enough to feed the populations that urban life requires. The great capitals of the ancient Near East, Nineveh and Babylon and Memphis, were cities of water as much as cities of stone, built on the banks of the rivers that sustained them. The Nabateans built their capital in a sandstone basin surrounded by cliffs, in a region where it rained perhaps 50 days a year at best, and where the summer heat would evaporate exposed water faster than natural processes could replenish it. They did not find water there. They created the conditions in which water could be captured, stored, and distributed to a population of tens of thousands of people across a city that spread over several square kilometers of rugged mountain terrain. The engineering they developed to accomplish this was not simple improvisation. It was a sophisticated hydraulic system involving hundreds of cisterns carved into the rock, a network of channels and pipes cut across the cliffs and through the stone, dams built in the wadis to catch flash floodwater before it could escape the basin, and settling tanks to filter the silt from the water before it entered the storage system. The scale and the precision of this system, which archaeologists have been mapping and studying in increasing detail over the past several decades, suggest a community that had been thinking about water for a very long time, that had accumulated knowledge across generations, and that had developed an engineering tradition capable of solving one of the most difficult problems that any ancient city ever faced. Petra survived for several centuries as a major urban center, not despite its desert location, but partly because of it. The same aridity that made it technically challenging to inhabit also made it strategically valuable. The trade routes of the ancient Near East passed through the region, and a community that controlled those routes and could sustain itself in a location that most other groups found uninhabitable held an enormous commercial advantage. The Nabatean insight was that the desert was not an obstacle to be avoided, but an asset to be managed. Most potential competitors could not follow them into terrain this harsh, and the communities that could operate in the desert with the efficiency and safety that the Nabateans had developed held an advantage that no purely military force could easily overcome. The desert was their moat, their wall, and their road, simultaneously the protection of their city and the highway of their commerce. The landscape that contains Petra is among the most dramatic in the ancient Near East. The sandstone mountains of southern Jordan have been shaped by millions of years of geological uplift and erosion into a terrain of extraordinary visual power. Narrow canyons called wadis cutting through the rock, isolated massifs rising hundreds of meters above the surrounding terrain, cliff faces stained in colors ranging from cream to deep crimson by the iron oxides in the stone. The ancient Greeks called the rock rose red, and while that description is more poetic than literally accurate, the colors of the Petra sandstone in afternoon light, shifting through orange and pink and burgundy as the sun moves, do produce something that deserves a poetic name. The basin in which the main city of Petra was built is surrounded on all sides by mountains, creating a natural amphitheater roughly 2 kilometers wide and 3 kilometers long. The mountains are not merely scenic backdrop. They are the essential infrastructure of the city, providing the stone from which the monuments were carved, the cliff faces into which the tombs and facades were cut, and the watershed system whose seasonal flash floods the Nabateans harnessed for their water supply. Understanding Petra requires understanding its geology, because the city was not built on its landscape. It was built from it. The sandstone of the Petra region is remarkably well suited to carving. It is soft enough to be worked with iron tools without excessive difficulty, but hard enough to hold the precise details of architectural ornament without crumbling. The Nabatean carvers who created the facades and tombs of Petra worked with the stone's natural characteristics, following the lines of the rock and exploiting its vertical fractures to create facades of considerable size without the need for quarried and transported stone. The rock was simultaneously the canvas and the material, the mountain and the monument. The sandstone of the Petra region was quarried not only for carving into facades, but also as a building material for the freestanding structures of the lower city, and the quarry marks visible in various locations around the basin show where building stone was cut from the rock faces and wadi floors. The quarrying activities were carefully managed to avoid undermining the stability of the facades above, and the spatial organization of quarrying and carving activities around the basin reflects a community that understood the geology of its surroundings in sophisticated practical terms. The wadis that drain the mountains around Petra are the key to understanding the city's water supply. During the winter rainy season, which in this region is unpredictable but occasionally intense, the wadis can carry massive volumes of water in a matter of minutes, flash floods that would be lethal if encountered in the narrow canyon passages and devastating if allowed to flow unchecked through the city's lower areas. The Nabateans built dams across these wadis to catch and redirect the floodwater before it could do damage or escape the basin, channeling it instead into the cisterns and storage systems that sustained the city through the long dry months that followed. The Nabateans appear in the historical record in the 4th century BCE, when Greek sources begin to mention them as inhabitants of the territory east of the Jordan River and south of the Dead Sea. They were already, by that point, a formidable presence in the region. A Greek account from around 312 BCE describes a military expedition against the Nabateans that failed because the attackers could not find the Nabatean settlement, which was said to be in a naturally fortified rock location, and because the Nabateans kept their goods in easily portable form rather than in fixed buildings that could be captured or destroyed. This account, which probably refers to Petra or to an earlier occupation of the same site, suggests a community that was already exploiting the strategic advantages of the Petra Basin and that had developed a mobile, flexible economy suited to the uncertainties of life in the desert borderlands. Over the following centuries, the Nabateans transformed from a semi-nomadic trading people into the rulers of a substantial kingdom whose territory at its height extended from the Hejaz in the south to Damascus in the north, and whose commercial network connected the Arabian Peninsula, the Mediterranean coast, and the overland routes of the ancient Near East. The capital they built at Petra grew from a fortified trading post into a city of sophisticated architecture, elaborate tombs, paved colonnaded streets, and the hydraulic infrastructure that made permanent urban habitation in this dry landscape possible. The Nabatean kingdom was formally absorbed into the Roman Empire in 106 CE, when the Emperor Trajan incorporated the kingdom as the province of Arabia Patria. The transition was peaceful, and Petra continued to function as a significant city under Roman rule, adding new architectural elements in the Roman style to its existing built environment. But the economic basis of the city, the control of overland trade routes, was gradually undermined over the following centuries as maritime trade routes replaced the overland ones and as the commercial geography of the ancient world shifted in ways that reduced the strategic value of the location that had made Petra great. By the time a major earthquake struck the region in 363 CE, damaging many of the city's structures and disrupting its water infrastructure, the population had already begun to decline. The city was not immediately abandoned after the earthquake. A reduced population continued to occupy parts of Petra through the Byzantine period and into the early Islamic period, and the site retained some religious and administrative significance for several centuries. But the great city of the Nabatean period was over, its temples converted to churches and its elaborate facades slowly obscured by the sand and debris that gradually accumulated in the abandoned spaces. The monuments of Petra fall into several distinct categories, each reflecting a different function within the life of the Nabatean city and a different relationship between the built environment and the natural rock. The facades that line the wadis and cliff faces of the Petra Basin are the most immediately impressive category. These are architectural compositions carved directly into the face of the sandstone, their columns and pediments and decorative elements created not by assembling cut stone but by removing the surrounding rock to leave the facade standing in relief. The treasury is the most famous example, but there are hundreds of others, ranging from simple doorways cut into the cliff to elaborate multi-story compositions with full classical architectural programs. Many of these facades served as the entrances to tomb chambers cut into the rock behind them, and the relationship between the elaborate exterior and the plain interior, a simple rock-cut room with no decoration and no furniture, is one of the recurring puzzles of Petra's architecture. The colonnaded street that runs through the center of the lower city follows the line of a wadi that was paved over in the Roman period, and it represents the most conventional element of Petra's urban plan: a straight, paved, colonnaded thoroughfare of the type found in Roman provincial cities across the Near East. The columns that lined it, of which many still stand or have been re-erected, were part of a wholesale reorganization and monumentalization of the city center that the Nabateans undertook in the 1st century CE, building in stone in a style that combined local traditions with the Hellenistic and Roman architectural vocabulary that was spreading across the Mediterranean world. The temples of Petra are among the less well-preserved structures on the site, their above-ground masonry having been quarried for building material over the centuries. The Qasr al-Bint, which stands in the lower city and retains substantial portions of its walls, is the best-preserved freestanding temple structure at the site and gives some sense of the monumental scale at which the Nabateans were working in their city's mature period. The temple's orientation, aligned toward the mountain of Jebel en-Mer to the north, may reflect astronomical or ritual considerations specific to Nabatean religious practice. The High Place of Sacrifice, a rock-cut ritual platform on the summit of Jebel Madba that overlooks the city, represents a different kind of architectural investment. Not carved facades or colonnaded streets, but a carefully worked open-air space at an elevated location, with altars and drainage channels cut into the rock surface, and a processional approach that climbs the mountain through a series of carved obelisks and rock-cut channels. The High Place connects Petra to a tradition of hilltop sacred space that runs through many ancient Near Eastern cultures, and that at Petra found its natural expression in the dramatic mountain landscape that surrounded the city. The drainage channels cut into the rock surface of the High Place are a detail that speaks to the practical even within the sacred. Animal sacrifice produced blood, and the channels were designed to carry it away from the altar area and out of the sacred space. The combination of ritual function and engineering practicality in a single carved feature is very characteristic of the Nabatean approach to the built environment, where the functional and the symbolic are rarely fully separated. Movement through Petra was shaped by the topography of the basin in ways that no amount of urban planning could have entirely overcome. The main entrance through the Sikh opened onto the area of the treasury and the Street of Facades, a sequence of tomb facades that line the walls of a wadi as it broadens toward the lower city. This processional approach, from the narrow confines of the Sikh through the dramatic reveal of the treasury to the broader space of the tomb facades and finally to the colonnaded street of the city center, may have been entirely deliberate in its spatial and experiential effects. Whoever designed the relationship between the Sikh, the treasury, and the city beyond it understood how the compression of the narrow canyon and the sudden release into the carved facade would affect the person making the transition, and the effect has lost none of its power in 2,000 years. Within the city, movement was organized around the natural drainage lines of the basin, which determined where flat ground was available for streets and buildings and where the terrain was too steep or too rocky for conventional construction. The colonnaded street followed the main wadi. The markets and commercial areas clustered around the street. The temples occupied prominent positions on slightly elevated ground above the street level. The residential areas spread up the flanking hills, using terraces cut into the rock to create level surfaces for domestic construction. The water channels that ran through the city were not merely infrastructure. They were a feature of the urban landscape that shaped the experience of moving through the city in ways that the people of Petra would have been constantly aware of. The sound of water flowing through the ceramic pipes laid along the colonnaded street, the sight of the channels carved into the rock faces of the Sikh, the knowledge that the cisterns cut into the surrounding mountains held the water that sustained daily life. All of this was part of what it meant to inhabit Petra, and it was a constant reminder of the engineering achievement that made the city possible. The relationship between the living areas of the city and the tomb areas is one of the more distinctive features of Petra's urban organization. In most ancient cities, the tombs of the dead were located outside the inhabited area, separated from the living by physical distance and sometimes by specific legal or ritual prohibitions. At Petra, the tomb facades are woven into the fabric of the city, lining the wadi walls that define the main approach routes and clustering on the slopes immediately adjacent to the areas of dense habitation. The dead and the living shared the same landscape in Petra in a way that is unusual even by ancient standards. This spatial integration of the living and the dead may reflect the Nabatean practice of ancestral commemoration that is documented in the inscriptions and in the architectural provisions for ritual banqueting in front of the tombs. If the tombs were settings for ongoing social and ritual life, regularly visited by the living members of the family for feasting and commemoration, then their integration into the daily circulation routes of the city makes practical as well as symbolic sense. The ancestors were part of the community of Petra, present in the carved facades that defined the visual landscape of the city, accessible to the living members of their families in a way that a remote necropolis would not have allowed. The daily life of a Nabatean resident of Petra was shaped by the particular combination of a desert climate, a mountain topography, and an economy that was oriented primarily around long-distance trade. Water was the organizing principle of domestic life in a way that it was not in cities with reliable river access. The management of the household's water supply, the monitoring of the cistern levels, the knowledge of which channels were flowing and which were dry at any given time of year, the behavioral adaptations required to live with a water supply that was seasonal and finite rather than continuous and reliable. All of this was part of the cognitive and practical landscape of daily life in Petra. Archaeological analysis of the domestic spaces at Petra has found evidence for water storage in virtually every context. Small cisterns cut into the rock beneath houses, ceramic storage vessels, and the careful organization of indoor spaces around the need to conserve water during the long dry months. The trade economy that sustained the city meant that Petra was a place of constant movement and constant contact with the wider world. Caravans of camels loaded with incense from southern Arabia, spices from India, silks from China moving along the overland routes through Petra, and the merchants who accompanied them brought goods, information, languages, and cultural influences from across the ancient world into the city. The cosmopolitan character of Petra in its prime is reflected in its material culture, which combines Nabatean, Hellenistic, Roman, and Egyptian elements in ways that speak to a community that was simultaneously rooted in its specific location and connected to the broadest commercial networks of its time. The Nabatean diet, reconstructed from the botanical and faunal remains recovered in excavations, was more varied than the aridity of the landscape might suggest. Dates, olives, and various grains were the staples, supplemented by meat from the domesticated camels, goats, and sheep that were the foundation of the pastoral economy. Exotic foods brought along the trade routes, spices, dried fruits, and preserved products from distant regions, were available to at least the wealthier members of the community. The ceramic evidence suggests a tradition of elaborate food preparation and presentation that is more consistent with a sophisticated urban culture than with the simple dietary practices of a desert community. The camel was as central to the Nabatean economy as the cistern. Without the camel's ability to travel long distances between water sources and to carry heavy loads across terrain that was impassable for wheeled vehicles, the overland trade routes that sustained Petra's wealth would not have been viable. The Nabateans were among the most skilled camel handlers and caravan organizers in the ancient Near East, and the management of large camel caravans, including the logistics of watering and feeding the animals along routes that could cross hundreds of kilometers of waterless terrain, was a specialized knowledge that constituted one of the community's most important commercial assets. The Nabatean camel saddle, developed specifically for the pack camel rather than the riding camel, was a technological innovation that significantly increased the load-carrying capacity of the animals and contributed to the efficiency of the overland trade system. Small innovations of this kind, invisible in the landscape of grand monuments and elaborate tombs, were often as important to the practical functioning of the Nabatean commercial system as the more visually spectacular achievements of the hydraulic engineers and the tomb carvers. The water system of Petra is the achievement that most consistently astonishes modern engineers and hydrologists who examine it closely. The system was designed to capture every possible source of water in the basin. The seasonal rainfall that fell directly on the city and its immediate surroundings, the flash floodwater that rushed down the wadis after intense rainstorms, and the spring water that seeped from certain geological formations in the rock. Each source required a different engineering approach, and the Nabatean hydraulic engineers developed effective solutions for all of them. The most critical element was flood control. The wadis that drain into the Petra Basin can carry enormous volumes of water after heavy rain, and without intervention this water would simply rush through the city and escape through the natural drainage channels to the south. The Nabateans built a series of dams across the main wadis at strategic points above the city to catch the floodwater before it could escape. The dam across the main wadi below the Sik, which would have protected the city from the devastating flash floods that could pour through the narrow passage, is one of the most impressive pieces of civil engineering at the site. A diversion tunnel cut through the rock beside the Sik directed the floodwater around the city rather than through it, protecting the built environment from the same floods that were simultaneously being captured in cisterns higher up in the watershed. The cisterns themselves were cut into the rock throughout the city and its surrounding mountains. Some were small, serving individual households or small groups of houses. Others were enormous, capable of storing tens of thousands of liters of water. They were plastered on the interior to prevent seepage, and they were covered to reduce evaporation in the dry Petra summers. The total storage capacity of the cisterns at Petra has been estimated at several tens of millions of liters, enough to supply a population of tens of thousands of people through a dry season of 8 or 9 months if managed carefully. The channels that distributed water from the cisterns and from the spring known as Ain Musa to the various parts of the city were a combination of carved rock channels and ceramic pipes. The ceramic pipes are among the most technically sophisticated elements of the system. They were manufactured in sections and fitted together with sealed joints, and the sections were shaped to maintain the correct gradient for water flow over long distances across irregular terrain. Many of these pipes have been found in excavations throughout the city, and their distribution gives a picture of a water distribution network that reached most inhabited areas of Petra. The total investment of labor required to construct the Petra water system has been estimated by hydraulic engineers who have studied the infrastructure in detail, and the numbers are striking. The cutting of a single cistern of moderate size would have required several hundred person-days of work in rock that, while relatively soft for sandstone, was still stone and required iron tools and sustained physical effort to excavate. Multiplied across hundreds of cisterns, plus the channels, the pipes, the dams, and the diversion tunnel, the total labor investment represents a community commitment to the water system that is comparable to the commitment represented by the Great Tomb facades. The invisible infrastructure was as significant an achievement as the visible monuments. The religion of the Nabateans is imperfectly understood, partly because the Nabateans were not a culture that produced extensive written records of their beliefs, and partly because their religious practices appear to have been considerably less ostentatious than those of the Greek and Roman cultures with which they had sustained contact. The Nabatean religious calendar, which is incompletely understood from the surviving evidence, appears to have included major festivals associated with the agricultural and pastoral seasons as well as ceremonies specific to the major deities. The evidence for communal feasting in the triclinia associated with the tomb complexes suggests that these festivals involved large gatherings of the population, occasions when the normal rhythms of daily life were interrupted for collective celebration and ritual commemoration. The scale of some of the triclinia, which could accommodate dozens of diners, points to gatherings of significant community-wide importance rather than purely private family events. The main Nabatean deity was Dushara, a god associated with mountains and with the landscape of the Nabatean homeland, whose cult image was typically an uncarved block of stone rather than a figural representation. This aniconic tradition, the representation of the divine in abstract rather than figurative form, is one of the most distinctive features of Nabatean religious culture and one that sets it apart from the anthropomorphic religious imagery of the Hellenistic and Roman worlds with which the Nabateans were in continuous contact. The preference for the undressed stone as a divine symbol speaks to a religious sensibility oriented toward the raw landscape itself, toward the mountains and the rock formations of southern Jordan, as the primary locus of sacred power. Al-Uzza, associated with the Greek Aphrodite and later with the Roman Venus, was another major deity, and her cult is documented in inscriptions and in the remains of religious structures throughout the Nabatean world. The religious architecture of Petra reflects this dual orientation, toward the indigenous traditions represented by Dushara and the mountain landscape, and toward the Hellenistic religious culture that was spreading across the ancient Near East in the same period. The temples of Petra combine elements of both traditions in ways that speak to a community that was actively negotiating its relationship to the broader cultural world it was part of. The elaborate tomb facades of Petra have a religious dimension that goes beyond their function as burial chambers. The care invested in the exterior appearance of the tombs, and the evidence for ritual activity in the precincts immediately in front of them, suggest that the tombs served as settings for ongoing religious practice associated with the veneration of ancestors and the commemoration of the dead. Banqueting rooms, called triclinia, are associated with many of the major tomb complexes at Petra, and the evidence suggests that ritual meals were held in these spaces, probably in connection with the annual or periodic commemoration of the individuals buried within. The combination of elaborate architectural display and provisions for communal feasting in front of the tomb reflects a religious culture in which the relationship between the living and the dead was managed through specific ritual practices that brought the community together around the memory of its ancestors. The Nabatean language and script are among the most consequential legacies of the civilization, not for any reason intrinsic to Nabatean culture itself, but for what came after them. The Nabatean script is a form of Aramaic writing that was the official written medium of the Nabatean kingdom and that appears on inscriptions throughout the ancient Near East, from the Sinai Peninsula to the Hejaz to the Syrian steppe. It was a cursive script, its letters connected in ways that made it well suited to quick writing on papyrus or other perishable materials, and it was widely used for commercial and administrative purposes across the region. When the Nabatean kingdom was absorbed into the Roman Empire, the Nabatean script did not disappear. It continued to be used, and it gradually evolved into new forms that were eventually adopted by the Arab communities of the Arabian Peninsula. The script that those communities used eventually became the Arabic script, the writing system in which the Quran was recorded and in which one of the world's major languages is written today. The Nabatean contribution to the history of writing is therefore not small. The connection between Nabatean Aramaic and the Arabic script is direct and documented, and the transformation that the Nabatean cursive tradition underwent in the centuries following the end of the Nabatean kingdom was one of the paths through which the ancient Semitic writing traditions of the Near East were transmitted into the medieval and modern world. The inscriptions left by the Nabateans across the landscape of the ancient Near East are one of the most geographically extensive documentary records of any ancient Near Eastern culture. They appear not only at Petra and at the major Nabatean cities but also along the trade routes, carved into rock faces at prominent locations, recording the names of individuals and their prayers to the Nabatean gods. These graffiti, left by merchants, soldiers, travelers, and pilgrims, are a form of ancient social media, a distributed record of movement and presence across the desert landscape that connects the formal inscriptions of the city to the daily lives of the people who moved through the Nabatean world. The inscriptions in the Nabatean script that survive at Petra and at other sites across the former kingdom provide the most direct evidence available for the Nabatean language and for many aspects of Nabatean social and commercial life. They record the dedications of temples and tombs, the transactions of merchants, the names of rulers and private individuals, and the terms of legal agreements. They are, alongside the physical remains of the city itself, the primary source through which the civilization of the Nabateans can be recovered and understood. The Nabatean language was a form of Aramaic, the international language of the ancient Near East in the centuries before and after the Common Era, but it had its own distinctive features and vocabulary that mark it as the specific dialect of a specific community. How widely it was spoken in daily life, as opposed to being used primarily for official and commercial purposes, and how it related to the Arabic dialects that were spoken in the region, are questions that the available evidence does not definitively resolve. The trade routes that made the Nabatean kingdom wealthy connected three of the ancient world's major commercial zones: the Arabian Peninsula, the Mediterranean basin, and the overland routes to the east. The most lucrative trade flowing through Petra was in frankincense and myrrh, the aromatic resins produced by trees that grew in southern Arabia and the Horn of Africa and that were essential to religious practice across the ancient Mediterranean world. Greek and Roman temples burned frankincense in enormous quantities, the demand sustained by the requirements of religious observance in cities from Rome to Alexandria to Athens. The supply came from trees that grew only in a specific and distant region, and the route that connected the production zone to the consumption zone passed through the territory of the Nabateans. The specific geography of the Nabatean trade network gave certain nodes within it particular strategic importance. The city of Hijra, known today as Madain Salah in northwestern Saudi Arabia, was the second city of the Nabatean kingdom and guarded the southern approaches to the trade routes from the Hijaz. Its spectacular rock-cut tombs, carved in the same tradition as those of Petra but in a landscape even more dramatically arid, are among the best preserved examples of Nabatean architectural achievement outside Petra itself, and they testify to the wealth and the organizational capacity that the kingdom could deploy far from its capital. The Nabateans did not simply allow other merchants to use their routes. They organized the trade, providing the camel caravans that transported the goods, the water stations that made the desert crossings possible, the security that protected the merchants and their merchandise from the raiders and competitors who were always present along the desert routes, and the financial services, essentially a form of banking and insurance, that allowed merchants to undertake the capital investment required for long-distance trade. In return, the Nabateans collected tolls and took a portion of the value of every transaction that moved through their territory. The income that this control of trade generated was enormous, and it funded the architectural and hydraulic investments that transformed Petra from a defensible rock basin into a major urban center. The wealth of the Nabatean elite is visible in the elaborate tomb facades, in the imported ceramics and metalwork found in excavations throughout the city, and in the sophistication of the religious and civic architecture of the city's mature period. Petra was not a wealthy city by accident. It was wealthy because the Nabateans had constructed an economic system that extracted value from the flow of goods through their territory and reinvested that value in the infrastructure that made the system work. By the 1st century CE, the trade flowing through Petra included not only Arabian incense but also spices from India, silk from China, cotton from Egypt, and a wide range of luxury goods that moved along the complex overland and maritime routes that connected the ancient world's major economies. The shift toward maritime trade in the Indian Ocean, facilitated by the Roman understanding of the monsoon winds that made direct sailing to India possible, was already beginning to undercut the overland routes by the time Petra was absorbed into the Roman Empire, and this shift in commercial geography was one of the long-term factors that contributed to the eventual decline of the city. The Nabatean ceramic tradition is among the most technically refined of the ancient Near East, and it is one of the clearest markers of Nabatean cultural identity across the geographic extent of their territory. The eggshell pottery for which the Nabateans are famous is a form of handmade ceramic with walls so thin and so evenly fired that they have the translucency and the delicacy of fine porcelain, produced centuries before the Chinese techniques that would eventually dominate world ceramic production. The bowls and cups of this tradition, typically decorated with fine painted designs of floral and geometric motifs, are found at Nabatean sites throughout the ancient Near East and serve as reliable indicators of Nabatean commercial presence wherever they appear. Their technical quality speaks to a ceramic tradition that had been refined over a very long period, passing down from one generation of potters to the next the specific knowledge of clay preparation, forming technique, and firing control that was required to achieve the eggshell effect. The paradox of fine ceramics in a trading culture is that ceramics are among the most fragile and least portable of objects. The presence of Nabatean eggshell pottery at sites throughout the ancient Near East may therefore speak not only to Nabatean commercial presence but also to the specific cultural practices of Nabatean merchants who carried their own ceramic ware with them as they traveled, maintaining their domestic habits and their cultural identity while operating in foreign commercial environments. The pottery is in some respects a marker of identity as much as it is a commercial product. The painted designs on Nabatean pottery are a distinctive artistic tradition in their own right, characterized by a combination of floral, leaf, and geometric motifs painted in red or brown on a cream-slip ground. The designs were executed with a confidence and a fluency that speaks to practitioners who had internalized the visual vocabulary of the tradition deeply enough to execute it quickly and consistently across a high volume of production. The same visual vocabulary appears in other media, in the painted decoration of tomb chambers and in the relief carving of architectural elements, suggesting a shared aesthetic sensibility that ran across different craft traditions and different contexts of production. The fine pottery of the Nabateans was not, however, the only ceramic tradition active at Petra. Alongside the eggshell ware, excavations have recovered a wide range of more utilitarian ceramics used for storage, cooking, and transport, many of which show influence from the broader Mediterranean and Near Eastern ceramic traditions with which the Nabateans were in contact through their commercial networks. The ceramic assemblage of Petra is, in this sense, a microcosm of the city's broader cultural situation, a specific and distinctive local tradition in dialogue with a much wider world. The study of Nabatean pottery has been transformed in recent decades by the application of chemical analysis techniques that can identify the specific clay sources from which different vessels were made. This analysis has shown that while the distinctive eggshell pottery was produced within the Nabatean homeland, using local clays with specific mineral compositions, the site also imported ceramics from a wide range of external sources, from the Eastern Mediterranean, from Egypt, and from elsewhere in the ancient Near East. The ceramic evidence for import and export patterns at Petra complements and in some cases corrects the picture that the literary sources alone would provide. The mystery of the Nabatean water system lies not in the engineering itself, which is well documented and increasingly well understood, but in the organizational capacity that the engineering implies. Building and maintaining a hydraulic system of the scale and complexity of Petra's water infrastructure required a level of social organization and institutional continuity that goes well beyond what any individual or small group could provide. The cisterns had to be cut, plastered, covered, and monitored. The channels had to be cleaned of silt after each flood season. The dams had to be inspected and repaired. The pipes had to be replaced when they cracked or leaked. The entire system had to be managed as a unified whole, with decisions made about which cisterns to fill first, how to distribute water across the city during dry periods, and how to respond to the irregular and unpredictable episodes of flooding and drought that characterized the climate of southern Jordan. Who performed this management, and under what institutional arrangements, is a question that the available evidence addresses only partially. The Nabatean inscriptions mention water rights and water allocations in terms that suggest a formal system of property rights over water, and the scale and coordination of the hydraulic infrastructure implies some form of public or quasi-public authority capable of organizing and maintaining work across the entire basin. But the specific institutions through which this authority operated, whether it was a royal administration, a priestly authority, a guild of hydraulic specialists, or some combination of these, is not clearly documented in the surviving sources. The question has practical as well as historical interest. How the Nabateans managed the commons problem of a shared water supply in an arid environment, where the failure to maintain the infrastructure would have catastrophic consequences for the entire population, is a question about institutional design that has parallels in contemporary debates about the governance of shared resources. The Nabatean solution, whatever it was, worked well enough to sustain a city of tens of thousands of people for several centuries in a desert environment. Understanding how it worked would be valuable not merely as ancient history, but as a case study in the management of scarce shared resources under conditions of high environmental stress. The seasonal character of the water supply was one of the central organizing facts of life at Petra. The cisterns were full after the winter rains and depleted through the long dry months that followed. The management of this seasonal cycle, the decisions about how much water to use in each month, which cisterns to draw from first, how to respond to years of unusually low rainfall that left the cisterns less full than expected, required a collective discipline that must have been deeply embedded in the social and cultural life of the community. Water consciousness, in a way that is difficult for people who have never lived with genuine water scarcity to fully imagine, was a constant feature of life in Petra. The collapse of the system, when it came, was not sudden. The earthquake of 363 CE damaged the infrastructure, but the city was not immediately abandoned. What appears to have happened is a gradual degradation of the system as the population declined and as the institutional capacity to maintain the infrastructure contracted. Cisterns fell into disuse. Channels silted up and were not cleaned. Dams were not repaired. The water system that had made Petra possible was gradually unmade by the same forces that were unmaking the city itself, the retreat of the institutional capacity that had created and sustained it. The relationship between Petra and the Roman Empire was more complex and more productive than the bare fact of annexation in 106 CE might suggest. The Nabatean kings who preceded annexation had maintained a careful balance in their relationships with the great powers of their region, aligning with Rome against Parthia when that served their interests, maintaining autonomous commercial policies when they could, and gradually incorporating elements of Hellenistic and Roman culture into the Nabatean built environment and administrative system as those influences became increasingly unavoidable. The Nabatean coinage, which had begun as a purely local affair with distinctly Nabatean iconographic conventions, gradually incorporated Roman-style portraiture and Latin inscriptions alongside the Nabatean Aramaic text, a material record of the community's navigation of its relationship with an increasingly dominant external power. The Nabatean kingdom had been a client state of Rome for decades before the formal annexation, maintaining a relationship of commercial and political cooperation that suited both parties. The Romans valued the Nabatean control of trade routes and their ability to project stability across a difficult and strategically important region. The Nabateans valued Roman protection against the larger powers to the north and east and Roman access to the Mediterranean markets that consumed so much of the trade that flowed through their territory. The formal annexation converted this relationship into direct Roman administration, but it did not fundamentally disrupt the commercial system on which Petra's prosperity depended. Under Roman rule, Petra received new architectural investment that transformed parts of the city's physical appearance without displacing the existing Nabatean-built environment. The colonnaded street that runs through the lower city is primarily a Roman period construction, overlaying and formalizing a commercial area that had existed under the Nabatean kingdom. The Nymphaeum, a monumental public fountain at one end of the colonnaded street, is a Roman element that did not exist in the Nabatean city, but that reflects the Roman tradition of celebrating the provision of water in monumental architectural form. The combination of Nabatean tomb facades on the cliff faces above and Roman colonnaded streets at the base of those same cliffs is one of the visual paradoxes of Petra. Two architectural traditions, representing two successive phases of the city's life, coexisting in the same landscape. The Nymphaeum that stood at the western end of the colonnaded street was a monument to the provision of water in the midst of a desert city, a public fountain of elaborate architectural design that celebrated, in the language of Roman monumental architecture, the achievement that had made Petra possible. That the Romans, who absorbed the Nabatean kingdom into their empire, chose to build a monumental water fountain in the center of the city that the Nabateans had sustained through their mastery of water engineering, is a detail with a poetic quality that the ancient sources do not comment on, but that the physical evidence preserves. The Roman city of Petra, formerly named Petra Metropolis Arabia, was the capital of the new province of Arabia Petrea and a significant administrative and commercial center. Its population remained substantial through the 2nd and 3rd centuries CE, and the investment in public infrastructure that Roman provincial administration typically brought, new buildings, paved roads, public water features, continued to transform the physical appearance of the city. The Petra of the Roman period was in some respects a more conventionally urban environment than the Nabatean city had been, with its colonnaded street, its monumental public buildings, and its administrative apparatus, but it retained the essential character that the Nabatean founders had given it, a city carved from and into the red sandstone mountains of southern Jordan, sustained by the engineering mastery of a community that had learned to live where others could not. The rediscovery of Petra by European scholarship in the early 19th century was itself a remarkable episode in the history of exploration. The city had not been entirely unknown to the outside world in the centuries following its abandonment. Local Bedouin communities knew the site and had maintained a presence in and around the ruins, using the ancient tomb chambers as shelters and the rock basins of the ancient city as seasonal pasture for their animals. The Swiss explorer Johann Ludwig Burckhardt, traveling in the region in 1812 disguised as an Arab merchant and using the name Ibrahim ibn Abdallah, persuaded a local guide to take him to the site under the pretext of wanting to make a sacrifice at the nearby tomb of Aaron. He became the first European to visit the site in the modern period, and his account of what he found, published posthumously in 1822, introduced Petra to a European readership that was simultaneously astonished and skeptical. The subsequent European and American exploration and documentation of the site through the 19th and early 20th centuries was thorough but not always scientifically rigorous by modern standards. The great facades were photographed and measured, the inscriptions were copied and published, and the general extent of the ruins was established. But systematic archaeological excavation of the kind that could recover the material evidence of daily life in the city, the pottery, the botanical and faunal remains, the structural evidence of domestic and commercial architecture, did not begin in earnest until the late 20th century. The scholars who came to Petra in the 19th century were looking for the spectacular, and they found it. But in focusing on the great facades and the dramatic landscape, they also looked past a great deal of evidence that a more systematic approach would have recognized as significant. The domestic areas of the city, the residential terraces, the workshops, the storage facilities, the spaces where people actually lived their daily lives, were largely ignored in favor of the tombs and temples that could be reproduced in the engravings and photographs that introduced Petra to a European audience. The Petra Archaeological Project, launched jointly by the Jordanian government and Brown University in 1992, and subsequent excavations by multiple international teams, have dramatically expanded the understanding of the city's domestic and commercial architecture, its water system, its agricultural hinterland, and the material culture of its Nabatean inhabitants. The focus of archaeological interest has shifted over the decades from the spectacular to the quotidian, from the great tomb facades to the houses and workshops and storage facilities where daily life was conducted, and the picture that has emerged from this shift in focus is considerably richer and more specific than the earlier focus on monumental architecture alone could have produced. The site is now a major tourist destination and a UNESCO World Heritage Site, visited by hundreds of thousands of people each year. The challenges of managing large volumes of visitors in a fragile archaeological landscape, while continuing to conduct the scientific research that expands the understanding of the site, are among the most pressing concerns of the Jordanian Department of Antiquities and of the international research community that works at Petra. The same qualities that make the site so compelling, the dramatic landscape, the carved facades, the sense of entering a lost world through the narrow passage of the sick, also make it vulnerable to the damage that large numbers of visitors can cause. Petra sits within a broader Nabatean landscape that extends far beyond the basin of the main city, and understanding the city requires understanding the network of sites and routes of which it was the center. The Nabatean commercial empire was not a territorially defined kingdom in the conventional sense, but a network of trade routes, way stations, and satellite communities extending across a vast area of the ancient Near East. The main routes that converged on Petra came from the south, along the Hejaz route from the Arabian Peninsula. From the east, crossing the Syrian steppe from Mesopotamia. From the north, descending from Damascus and the Hauran. And from the west, connecting to the Mediterranean ports of Gaza and Rhino Kalura. Each of these routes was supported by a system of way stations, typically located a day's caravan journey apart, where the camels could be watered and the merchants could rest. Many of these way stations were small Nabatean settlements with their own cisterns, their own carved facades, and their own connections to the network of inscriptions and commercial relationships that held the system together. The city of Oboda in the Negev Desert, known today as Avdat, is one of the best preserved of these satellite settlements and gives a good sense of what a Nabatean way station city looked like in its mature form. Like Petra, Oboda was built on a hill in a dry landscape, sustained by a water collection system that captured winter rainfall in cisterns and used it for agriculture as well as domestic consumption. The agricultural terraces of the Negev Highlands, where the Nabateans developed a sophisticated system of runoff agriculture that concentrated the limited annual rainfall to produce viable crop yields in a semi-arid environment, are among the most impressive examples of Nabatean agricultural engineering and among the most studied by researchers interested in the adaptation of agriculture to water-scarce environments. The overland routes through the Nabatean territory were maintained to a standard that allowed the efficient movement of heavy camel caravans across terrain that was, in some stretches, genuinely difficult. The roads were not paved in the Roman manner, but they were marked by cairns, by the carved inscriptions that travelers left on prominent rocks along the way, and by the way stations that provided water, food, and shelter at regular intervals. Managing this network across a territory of hundreds of thousands of square kilometers required the same combination of technical capacity and institutional continuity that the hydraulic system of Petra itself demanded. The Nabatean road network and the Nabatean water system were two expressions of the same organizational intelligence. The relationship between Petra and its satellite cities was not simply one of center and periphery. The satellite settlements were active commercial nodes in their own right, with their own economic relationships, their own religious installations, and their own contributions to the broader Nabatean network. Understanding the Nabatean kingdom requires thinking of it not as a conventional territorial state with a capital and a hinterland, but as a network, a set of nodes connected by routes and by the commercial and social relationships that the movement of goods and people along those routes sustained. The Nabatean attitude toward women and gender is better documented than that of most ancient Near Eastern cultures, partly because the Nabatean legal tradition preserved in inscriptions and papyri gives women a more prominent role in commercial and legal life than was typical of their contemporaries. The evidence for women's roles in the Nabatean religious sphere complements the evidence for their legal and economic agency. Women appear as dedicants of votive offerings at Nabatean religious sites, as priestesses in the service of specific deities, and as participants in the ritual feasting activities associated with the tomb complexes. The religious landscape of the Nabatean world was not exclusively male, and the prominence of female deities, particularly Al-Uzza, in the Nabatean pantheon may reflect a broader cultural accommodation of female authority in both the divine and the human spheres. Nabatean women appear in inscriptions as property owners, as parties to commercial contracts, as dedicants of religious offerings, and as individuals with their own legal standing and their own economic interests. The legal texts from the Nabatean period found in the Dead Sea region, which include marriage contracts, property transfers, and other commercial documents, show women acting independently in legal and commercial matters in ways that would have been unusual in the Roman or Jewish legal traditions of the same period and region. The tomb inscriptions of Petra are another source of evidence for the social position of Nabatean women. Women are named as tomb owners and as the dedicants of tomb complexes in proportions that suggest they had substantial control over property and over the disposition of that property after death. The investment represented by a major tomb facade at Petra was considerable, and the ability to commission and own such a monument was a mark of significant wealth and social standing. The frequency with which women appear in this capacity in the Petra inscriptions suggests a social structure in which women's economic agency, at least in the upper strata of Nabatean society, was genuine and recognized. The queens of the Nabatean kingdom are documented in the historical sources and in the inscriptions of the kingdom as figures of genuine political and public significance. The title given to Nabatean queens, which translates roughly as sister of the king, has been interpreted as indicating a specific constitutional role in the kingdom's governance rather than simply a marital relationship, and the prominence of queens in the coinage of the Nabatean kingdom, where they appear beside the king on equal terms, is unusual by the standards of ancient Near Eastern political representation. The Nabatean political system, whatever its specific institutional form, appears to have created space for female authority at its highest level that was not characteristic of the Greek, Roman, or Jewish political cultures with which the kingdom was in constant contact. The decline of Petra was a process that unfolded over several centuries and that involved a combination of economic, environmental, and political factors that reinforced each other in ways that made the decline difficult to reverse. The economic foundation of the city's prosperity, the control of overland trade routes connecting Arabia to the Mediterranean, was already under pressure by the 1st century CE. The Roman understanding of the monsoon wind patterns that governed sailing in the Indian Ocean, which allowed Roman merchants to sail directly from Egyptian ports to the Indian subcontinent and back, made it possible to bypass the overland routes through Arabia and the Nabatean territory that had been essential before direct maritime trade was possible. The goods that had previously been carried by Nabatean camel caravans could now be shipped more cheaply and more quickly by sea, and the commercial geography of the ancient world shifted accordingly. The population that Petra supported at its peak, estimated at between 20 and 30,000 people by most researchers, required an annual food supply that the agricultural hinterland of the city could not have fully provided. The deficit was made up through the commercial network that brought food into the city along the same routes that brought the luxury trade goods. When the commercial network contracted and the revenue it generated declined, the ability to import food declined with it, and the population of the city would have contracted in response. The demographic history of Petra's decline is a story of the interaction between commercial geography, food supply, and the institutional capacity to maintain the infrastructure that made the city habitable. The formal annexation of the Nabatean kingdom as the Roman province of Arabia Petrea in 106 CE removed the political autonomy that had allowed the Nabatean commercial system to function on its own terms, and the new Roman administration reorganized the provincial road network in ways that favored routes that did not necessarily run through Petra. The construction of the Via Nova Traiana, a new Roman road that ran along the eastern plateau to the east of the Petra basin rather than through it, redirected some of the overland traffic that had previously used the routes through Petra, reducing the city's commercial centrality within its own region. The earthquake of 363 CE was a significant event in the physical history of the site, but it was not in itself the cause of the city's abandonment. Byzantine sources document a continuing population at Petra in the centuries after the earthquake, and the city retained some administrative and religious significance as a bishop's seat in the early Christian period. What the earthquake did was accelerate a process of decline that had already been underway for some time, damaging infrastructure that was no longer being maintained at the level required to sustain the full population of the city's peak period, and reinforcing the sense that the community's future lay elsewhere rather than in the continued investment required to rebuild a city that was already losing its economic rationale. The gradual retreat of the population from Petra in the Byzantine and early Islamic periods was not a sudden abandonment but a slow process of relocation and dispersal, as individual households and family groups chose to move to settlements that offered better economic opportunities or more reliable water supplies. The last inhabitants of the ancient city left without catastrophe and without, apparently, any clear sense that they were the last. They simply left, as communities have always left places that no longer served them, and the sandstone mountains closed over the empty city as the centuries passed. What modern archaeology has learned about Petra in the past 3 decades represents a significant expansion of the understanding that the earlier focus on monumental architecture alone could provide. The systematic excavation of domestic and commercial areas at the site, rather than concentrating exclusively on the great tomb facades and the colonnaded street, has revealed a city that was denser, more varied in its architecture, and more complex in its social organization than the 19th and early 20th century accounts suggested. Residential areas on the slopes above the colonnaded street show a range of house types, from small single-room structures to larger multi-room compounds, reflecting the social diversity of a city that housed merchants, craftspeople, administrators, religious specialists, and the workers who maintained the hydraulic infrastructure alongside the wealthy elite whose tombs dominate the visual landscape of the site. The application of remote sensing technologies to the Petra landscape has revealed features that ground-level survey would have missed entirely. Satellite imagery analysis has identified the outlines of agricultural field systems in the valleys surrounding the city, the traces of ancient road surfaces, and the locations of structures that are not visible on the surface but whose remains affect the subtle topography of the ground above them. Drone survey and photogrammetric modeling of the cliff faces have created three-dimensional records of the carved facades at a resolution that allows details invisible to the naked eye to be measured and analyzed. The Petra that modern technology is revealing is considerably larger and more complex than the city that earlier generations of researchers could document. The Petra Garden and Pool Complex, discovered in excavations in the lower city, was a surprising find. A formal garden with an ornamental pool, fed by the city's water system, in the midst of a desert city. The discovery of this garden, which appears to have been a place of recreation and display in the heart of the city during the Roman period, transformed the understanding of how the Nabateans and their Roman successors used their mastery of water technology. The water system was not merely a survival mechanism. It was a cultural technology that enabled the creation of environments whose primary purpose was aesthetic and social pleasure. The mapping of the full extent of Petra's hydraulic infrastructure using a combination of ground survey, drone photography, and geographic information systems has produced a picture of the system that is considerably more complete and more impressive than the piecemeal accounts of earlier researchers. The total number of cisterns identified in and around the city now runs to several hundred, and the network of channels and pipes that connected them covers a geographic area of several square kilometers. The investment of labor required to create this system, and the institutional capacity required to maintain it, are only beginning to be fully appreciated. The agricultural hinterland of Petra, the terraced wadis and the managed runoff systems of the surrounding highlands, is another area where recent research has significantly expanded the understanding of how the city sustained itself. The Nabateans were not only importing food along the trade routes. They were producing a substantial portion of their food supply through an agricultural system specifically adapted to the arid conditions of the southern Jordanian plateau, using techniques that are now being studied seriously by researchers interested in their potential application to contemporary food production in water-scarce environments. What remains uncertain about Petra is, in some ways, what matters most. The political and administrative organization of the Nabatean kingdom is imperfectly understood, despite the abundance of inscriptions and the availability of Greek and Roman literary sources that describe the kingdom from the outside. The internal structure of Nabatean governance, the relationship between the king and the tribal leaders who appear in the inscriptions, the role of the religious institutions in political life, the mechanisms through which the commercial system was regulated and protected, are questions that the available evidence addresses only partially and often indirectly. The Nabateans were not a culture that produced the kind of extensive administrative documentation that has survived from Egypt or Mesopotamia, and the picture of how the kingdom actually worked on a day-to-day basis remains incomplete. The religious life of the Nabateans is another area of genuine uncertainty. The basic outlines are clear enough. The major deities, the main ritual practices, the general orientation of the tradition toward the landscape and the mountain. But the specific content of Nabatean religious belief, what the Nabateans understood themselves to be doing when they worshipped Dushara or Al-Uzza, what they believed happened to the dead and why the elaborate tomb complexes were worth the investment they required, is accessible only through inference from material evidence and through the filtered accounts of outside observers who did not always understand what they were describing. The question of what happened to the Nabatean population after the decline of the city is one that genetic and archaeological research is beginning to address. The Nabatean cultural tradition did not simply disappear with the political end of the Nabatean kingdom. It was absorbed into the Roman provincial culture of the region and eventually into the Arab and Islamic cultures that succeeded it. The specific channels through which Nabatean cultural practices, agricultural techniques, hydraulic knowledge, and commercial traditions were transmitted into the subsequent history of the region are a matter of active research, and the answers will help to clarify the relationship between the ancient Nabatean civilization and the cultures that inhabit the same landscape today. The physical condition of the site itself is an area of ongoing concern. The mud brick construction of many of the residential and commercial structures at Petra is vulnerable to erosion by rain, and the increase in rainfall variability associated with climate change is creating new challenges for the preservation of the site. The carved sandstone facades are relatively robust, but the finer details of their surface decoration are being gradually eroded by wind and water, and the management of this erosion without irreversibly altering the appearance of the monuments is a conservation challenge that does not have easy solutions. Petra changes how we think about the relationship between environment and civilization. The standard account of early urban civilization is an account of abundance. Cities grew where food was plentiful and water was reliable, in river valleys and coastal plains where the natural productivity of the landscape could support large populations. The history of civilization, on this account, is a history of favorable environments, and the civilizations we remember best, Egypt, Mesopotamia, the Indus Valley, are civilizations of agricultural abundance. Petra is a counterexample of a specific kind. It was not a civilization of abundance. It was a civilization of scarcity managed with extraordinary skill. The Nabateans did not find a favorable environment and build a city in it. They built a system of technologies and institutions that transformed an unfavorable environment into one that could support a city, and they sustained that transformation for several centuries through the continuous investment of labor, knowledge, and organizational capacity. The city of Petra is not evidence of what nature provided. It is evidence of what human ingenuity and social organization could achieve within the constraints that nature imposed. This reframing has implications for how we think about the relationship between environment and civilization more broadly. If the Nabateans could build a city of tens of thousands of people in one of the most arid landscapes of the ancient world, the relationship between environmental conditions and urban capacity is clearly not deterministic in the way that simpler accounts of environmental determinism would suggest. Communities can, and have, compensated for environmental constraints through technological and institutional innovation, and the specific form that their civilization takes is shaped as much by the innovations they develop as by the environments in which they find themselves. The Nabatean hydraulic tradition is relevant to contemporary challenges in ways that are not merely metaphorical. The techniques the Nabateans developed for capturing and storing rainfall in arid environments, for managing flash floodwater, for maintaining agricultural productivity in conditions of high aridity, are being studied seriously by researchers and practitioners working on water management in the Middle East and elsewhere. The runoff agriculture of the Negev highlands, in particular, has been the subject of both historical research and practical experimentation, and the results suggest that techniques developed nearly 2,000 years ago may have genuine relevance to the management of water in semi-arid environments today. The deeper lesson that Petra offers to contemporary thinking about water scarcity is not a specific technique but an attitude, that the management of water in an arid environment is a cultural achievement as much as a technical one, requiring the sustained commitment of a community across generations, the transmission of knowledge and practice through time, and the institutional capacity to maintain systems whose benefits are collective even when the costs of maintenance fall on specific individuals. The Nabateans sustained this commitment for 5 centuries. Whether contemporary societies facing increasing water scarcity can develop the equivalent commitment is one of the more important questions that the history of Petra raises. The people of Petra lived with a relationship to water that is difficult to fully imagine from within a culture of water abundance. Every drop of water in the cisterns of Petra had been specifically collected, stored, and managed by human effort. The rain that fell on the mountains during the winter season was precious not simply because it was water, but because it was the water, the resource on which everything else depended, the substance whose careful management made the city possible and whose loss or mismanagement could threaten the survival of tens of thousands of people. Living with this knowledge, day after day and season after season, would have created a relationship to water that was simultaneously practical and profound, a constant awareness of the fragility of the system that sustained daily life and of the human effort and institutional capacity on which that system depended. The merchants who traveled through Petra brought with them a different relationship to water. The desert crossings of the overland trade routes were among the most dangerous aspects of commercial life in the ancient Near East, and the skill and knowledge required to navigate them safely, to know where water could be found and how far a caravan could travel between sources, was a form of expertise as commercially valuable as any other in the Nabatean economic system. The way stations along the routes were not merely convenient stopping places. They were essential life support systems, and the Nabatean investment in maintaining them was an investment in the viability of the commercial system as a whole. The relationship between the city and the desert that surrounded it was not one of simple opposition. The desert was not merely a hostile environment that the city struggled to survive in. It was also the source of the city's wealth, the landscape through which the trade routes ran, the territory whose aridity created the commercial opportunity that the Nabateans were uniquely positioned to exploit. The desert gave Petra its strategic value and its economic rationale at the same time as it imposed the technical challenges that the city's hydraulic system was designed to overcome. The city and the desert were in a relationship of mutual definition, each making the other what it was in the specific context of the Nabatean world. The experience of walking through Petra in summer, in the full heat of a July afternoon when the temperature in the open parts of the basin can reach 45 degrees Celsius, is a vivid reminder of why water was so central to the community's concerns. In this heat, the water stored in the cisterns was not an abstraction or a convenience. It was the difference between life and death, and the knowledge that the cisterns were full or approaching empty, that the winter rains had been adequate or inadequate, that the maintenance work on the channels had been completed or neglected, was knowledge with immediate and personal consequences for every inhabitant of the city. The Nabatean relationship to water was not merely a technical achievement. It was a lived experience, felt in the body in a way that most inhabitants of modern cities can barely imagine. The carved facades of the tombs, looking out across the wadi floors of Petra at the desert mountains beyond, are perhaps the most direct expression of this relationship. The Nabateans carved their most elaborate architectural achievements into the rock of the mountains themselves, using the stone of the desert as both canvas and material, and orienting their most significant monuments toward the desert landscape that they had made their home. The city with no rain was not despite its desert but of it, in a way that the material culture of the Nabateans makes unmistakably clear. The central image of Petra, the one that the evidence keeps returning to, is the image of the sick. The narrow canyon passage, barely wide enough for a laden camel, its walls rising to heights that reduced the sky to a ribbon, its floor marked by the channels that carried water into the city. This is the threshold through which every visitor to Petra must pass, and it concentrates in a single, physically compelling experience the essential character of the Nabatean achievement. The sick is not a comfortable passage. It is a demonstration of what the Nabateans had accomplished, that a city of tens of thousands of people lay at the far end of this improbable entry, sustained by an engineering system whose first evidence appeared in those small channels cut into the base of the canyon walls. Walking through the sick, you are in the presence of a civilization that had decided to do something that most reasonable assessments of the landscape would have considered extremely difficult, and that had succeeded in doing it through an accumulation of technical knowledge, institutional capacity, and sheer sustained effort that extended across many generations. The water channels in the sick were not built by a single inspired engineer. They were built by a tradition, maintained and refined across centuries by a community that had made the management of water in an arid landscape its central technical and cultural preoccupation. The treasury, waiting at the far end of the sick, is the culminating image. The first view of the facade from the final narrowing of the canyon is calculated, whether by accident or by design, to produce the maximum visual impact. The sudden change of scale from the 2-meter width of the canyon to the 39-meter height of the carved facade, the shift from compressed shadow to the warm light of the open plaza, the revelation of an architectural achievement whose existence could not have been predicted from within the passage that led to it. This is the city that lived without rain. This is what it built. The rose-red stone of the mountains glows in the afternoon light, the colors shifting as the sun moves, and the carved figures of the treasury stand in their niches as they have stood for 2,000 years, looking out across a plaza that was once crowded with merchants and pilgrims and administrators and the everyday inhabitants of a city that should not have existed and did. The architectural program of the treasury's facade borrows heavily from the Hellenistic architectural vocabulary that was the common language of monumental building across the ancient Mediterranean world in the centuries before and after the Common Era. But it transforms that vocabulary in ways that are distinctly Nabatean. The broken pediment, the central tholos, the specific combination of architectural elements that produces an effect unlike any facade in the Greek or Roman world. The Nabatean architects who designed the treasury were not simply copying a foreign model. They were using a shared architectural language to say something specific, something about the Nabatean relationship to the Mediterranean world and to the desert landscape behind the facade. Modern Petra belongs to the Jordanian people and to the broader human heritage that it represents, and its management is one of the more complex challenges in contemporary archaeological site preservation. The site receives between 500,000 and 1 million visitors per year, numbers that create significant pressures on a landscape that was not designed for mass tourism and that contains fragile archaeological deposits that cannot be fully protected while remaining accessible. The paths through the site follow ancient routes in some cases and modern constructions in others, and the constant passage of feet, horses, and motor vehicles along these routes is a source of ongoing erosion and damage that is difficult to manage without restricting access in ways that conflict with the site's role as a major source of revenue for the Jordanian economy. The Bedouin communities that have lived in and around Petra for generations, and that were resettled from the site itself in 1985, have a particular relationship to the landscape that is both historically significant and practically important for the site's management. The traditional knowledge that these communities hold about the local landscape, its water sources, its seasonal rhythms, and its history, is a resource that archaeological and conservation researchers are increasingly recognizing as valuable for the scientific understanding and the practical management of the site. The Dawel Bedouin, who occupied the cave tombs of Petra as their homes until the 1980s, maintained a presence in a landscape that had been inhabited, in various forms, for more than 2,000 years. Their knowledge of the site's hidden water sources, of the seasonal flash flood patterns, and of the locations of archaeological features not yet known to researchers has contributed to the scientific understanding of the landscape in ways that formal survey methods alone would not have achieved. The relationship between traditional knowledge and scientific archaeology at Petra is a model that the broader field of archaeological heritage management is increasingly looking to as an example of productive collaboration. Climate change presents a new set of challenges for Petra that are only beginning to be understood. The region is projected to experience increased aridity and more extreme precipitation events in the coming decades, changes that will stress the already fragile archaeological deposits and the surrounding landscape in ways that the existing management frameworks may not be adequate to address. The flash floods that once fed the Nabatean cisterns now pose an increasing threat to the archaeological remains exposed in excavation and to the rock-cut structures whose stability depends on the slow and gradual weathering regime that has characterized the climate of the region for millennia. What the future holds for Petra is uncertain in ways that mirror the uncertainties that faced the Nabateans themselves. They built a city in a landscape that demanded constant management, constant investment of labor and knowledge and institutional capacity, and when those investments were no longer forthcoming, the city declined. The modern site faces analogous challenges, and the response to those challenges will determine how much of the Nabatean achievement survives for the generations who come after us. The sandstone that makes Petra so visually spectacular is also one of its most serious conservation challenges. The stone is soft enough to be worked by hand, but also soft enough to be eroded by wind, water, and salt crystallization in ways that are gradually destroying the finer details of the carved decoration. The surface of the treasury, which was crisp and precise when Burckhardt first described it in 1812, has softened and blurred in the 2 centuries since, and the rate of erosion is not decreasing. The question of how to slow or halt this process without introducing conservation interventions that themselves alter the character of the monument is one that conservators are working on with mixed success. The canyon is quiet at dawn. Before the visitors arrive, before the horse-drawn carriages begin their trips from the entrance to the treasury, before the guides gather at the head of the sick with their groups, the narrow passage is empty, and the silence in it is the kind of silence that has texture, shaped by the walls of red stone rising on either side and by the quality of the early morning light that fills the canyon from above. The water channels cut into the base of the walls are still there, empty now, their Nabatean purpose accomplished 2,000 years ago. But the stone that contains them is unchanged, the same rose-red sandstone that the Nabatean engineers cut their channels into, the same stone that 100 generations of inhabitants of this city touched every day as they moved through the passage that was the city's only entrance. The water channels carved into the base of the sick walls are still there after 2,000 years, their Nabatean precision still visible in the clean lines of the cuts. They no longer carry water. The system that fed them, the dams and the cisterns and the pipes, has been dismantled by time and by the slow withdrawal of the community that built and maintained it. But the channels themselves endure, carved into the same rock that the sick is carved from, inseparable from the landscape that contains them. They are, in their modest way, as much a monument to the Nabatean achievement as the treasury that waits at the end of the passage. At the far end of the sick, the treasury stands in the early morning light, its facade catching the first direct sun in colors that shift from gold to pink to cream as the light strengthens. The carved figures in their niches are in shadow still, the pediments and columns catching the horizontal light in ways that make every detail precise and clear. No one is watching. The plaza in front of the facade is empty. The city that once surrounded this monument, the colonnaded street, the temples, the residential terraces, the cisterns full of carefully managed rainwater, is silent and still. The desert mountains of southern Jordan have always been here. The Nabateans came, built something extraordinary in the space between the cliffs, sustained it for 5 centuries through a combination of engineering genius and commercial acuity and institutional capacity, and then left, slowly, generation by generation, until the city was empty and the desert quiet. What they left behind is still here. The carved stone, the channels, the cisterns, the facades, the extraordinary act of will and knowledge and sustained effort that said, in this unlikely place, we will make our home. The city with no rain. The city that lived by engineering what nature withheld. The city that waited, empty and patient in its red mountains, until the world was ready to rediscover what it had been. If this documentary kept you company through the night, there is more waiting for you. Choose the next film on screen, and let the story keep unfolding.